But let's get started with my first question, which is that you've worked with a lot of CPOs over the years. I wonder if you've kind of observed if the role has changed over that time.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, the role for CPOs definitely changed significantly in the last decade or so. I mean, I started my career in industry where I worked for a few CPOs, and then last 15 years or so in the consulting service delivery space where I got a chance to work with a lot of CPOs as well. And also meeting with a lot of them during conferences and a few other setups. I realized like the type of tasks that the individuals do versus the responsibilities that they carry changed significantly, and the expectations changed significantly as well. If I look back like 20 years ago, CPOs used to be like this key role that contributed to the bottom line, managed risk, drove compliance, build, like if they are strategic, they're building those risk mitigation strategies ahead of time. Like those used to be the expectations. Right? Over the period of time, especially in the last decade, I would say, the role has become a lot more value generation or revenue enablement role as compared to like a cost savings role. I think we talked about this a little bit in the previous podcast as well. Cost savings is table stakes. I mean, nobody really talks about like cost savings as part of your responsibility. That's just part of the job. But what is important is how are you contributing to the value for the organization? And a lot of times it's actually becoming how are you enabling the revenue, right? And when I look at how it kind of is reflected in where the chief procurement officers or the chief supply chain officers are positioned within the organization, kind of reflect that. You will see a lot more CPOs and the chief supply chain officers reporting to the CEOs as a trend. Because then that shows that function has matured quite a bit. People see this as a value generation activity versus a support function. And CPOs are spending a lot more time collaborating with the business unit leaders, CEOs, to put together the long-term strategies for that value generation versus coming up with what's my cost savings plan for next year, right? It's all about how do you optimize the overall P&L and how do you enable managing the P&L for the CEOs and the CFOs of the world. And that's creating a lot more kind of nuanced expectation with these chief procurement officers. We did a CPO survey recently, like hundreds of CPOs across multiple industries across the globe. And we asked this question, right? How do you see your role within the organization? And that's one of the survey questions that you ask. And it was evident that pretty much almost 70 to 80% of them saw themselves as strategic role. And then you kind of question, is this a self-awareness thing, or is this how they're positioned within the organization, right? So we asked that question, okay, where do you report up to, right, within the organization? And historically, if you think about like CPOs, like maybe up to 10 to 20 years ago, is most of them either reported to a COO or a CFO or within the finance function, or sometimes even within the business sometimes.
Some random role, maybe legal or something sometimes.
And then you would kind of realize like now they roll up to like, especially like, for example, Jabil, our chief supply chain officer directly reports to the CEO, right? That's not uncommon. That has been like pretty common across various industries. And that also shows then as a function, it is well respected. It's seen as a value generation activity. It's seen as somebody that gives you a competitive advantage. And that kind of changes the role as a CPO and what the expectations are with that role as well.
So those are all positives to hear for sure, because I think we spent a lot of time fighting for relevance in a number of organizations. But as you think about the changes in positioning of a CPO, does that change the profile of a CPO? What organizations are looking for in recruiting somebody into that role?
That's an interesting question, Phil. I think the answer is absolutely. And if I kind of think about what were the critical characteristics of a CPO maybe 10, 20 years ago, and what was expected, right? And if I want to kind of put a box around it, it's somebody needs to be analytical. Somebody needs to be a good negotiator. They need to be a strong operator, and they need to carry strong ethics and compliance mindset, right? With those, if I want to kind of put a box around it. Nobody would say that the CPO needs to be charismatic. Like, and if I want to kind of say, like, is that a characteristic that is needed? Because, it would be nice to have, but not necessarily the most needed characteristic. But if you look at a lot of the CPOs in the industry right now, that's one of the major characteristics you will see common across the CPOs. Like there's all the other boxes that we talked, like the elements of boxes that we talked about. But on top of that, having somebody that has strong selling skills, have a charismatic personality, or they have good influencing skills, which tend to be traditionally like a sales-focused or a CEO-focused characteristics. And you see those as an important characteristic of a CPO, right? And if you think about these characteristics, they were reserved. If you ask like a HR generalist, say, okay, are these the characteristics that we look for a CPO? They may not have said that 10 years ago, but now they would, because they see this as a key role that needs to influence across the industry, across supplier base, across their peers, and be able to get their way on influencing their own agenda, right? And for that, you need that specific skill set. This also becomes kind of evident in, like, a lot of times CPO roles internally get filled through some rotations, right? And you will, if you look like a few years ago, where those internal rotations used to be, like Chief Supply Chain Officer or a Chief Procurement Officer, there will be mostly a finance person who wants to become a CFO, doing that as a half a step to get like an overall rounded experience within the organization and get a good sense of operations. Now you would see, like we're seeing areas where the clients, somebody that does a rotation from operations, they might have done rotations from sales, so that they get a good sense for supply chain and operations, how things get done, so that they can be effective leader in the longer run, right? And that also shows how important the role has become just from a characteristic perspective. And that's another kind of a checkbox within this profession, where people are seeing this as not only as a career roadmap within procurement and supply chain space, but also an experience that is needed to round yourself up to become a better leader in the long run.
Yeah, it's kind of on the career track of a CEO more than it used to be, which was, oftentimes it was a singular career path in procurement. You started as a buyer and you tried to achieve becoming a CPO, and then you achieve becoming a CPO, and there's not really anywhere to go from there. Do you see that domain expertise, and what I mean domain expertise is understanding of different functional areas, makes it easier to have influence as a CPO? And so, you've worked in marketing, or you've worked in sales, or you've worked in finance, or you've been a stakeholder, that kind of immediately gives you, if you were able to bring that experience or empathize with understanding what that experience means, that gives you greater influence when you step into a CPO role amongst your peers.
Absolutely. So if you come from a business unit, operations background, or like a marketing function where you are go-to-market leader, and you move into a CPO role, you may not have had like the traditional procurement trajectory in the career, but being able to translate the customer requirements into procurement requirements is a big skill. And I think it also puts emphasis in how do you operationalize those requirements into results. And then that makes you a stronger leader in the longer run, right? I always use, like you just talked about it, like, is the CPO track leads you to as a potential option to become a CEO, right? And 20 years ago, most probably, no, absolutely not.
Right.
There is no way.
One or two examples, and we'd all focus on those one or twos, but they were really outliers.
And then everybody will talk about Tim Cook, right? As one of the examples, like supply chain person that became a CEO. But I think Tim Cook is more operations than supply chain. And supply chain was the key part of the responsibility. But what made him a stronger CEO is like having that holistic business operations experience. So if I want to kind of take a other side of the story, is like, if you're a CPO and want to become like a target CEO audience, for example, I think what is critical is making sure that the CPOs have some sort of direct P&L revenue generation activities and not just a revenue enabler. And whether, how do you get that experience? I think that becomes critical for somebody to kind of get that rounded experience the other way around, if somebody is a CPO and wants to become a CEO.
So I want today for the rest of the conversation to focus on kind of the first 100 days of a CPO. So you're in a new role as a CPO. Rather than going into specifics up front, from your perspective, where do you even start? Like your day one, you're in position, you have a new team, maybe it's a new organization, maybe you've been rotated into this role, internally. What would be your recommendations in terms of putting together a roadmap to cover that first 100 days?
Sure. So I think if we think about anybody that is, any CPO that is getting into the role and starting, whether it's internal, external, it doesn't really matter, right? It's ultimately coming up with your own assessment of the organization quickly to come up with what your priorities are.
Yeah.
Right? So, for example, in our case, we do this for a lot of CPOs. We use like an 8-dimensional approach to do an assessment quickly.
Yeah.
That includes your traditional functional assessment, looking at your organization, looking at where you have gaps, where you have skills issues, whether you have performance issues, right? You do that as part of your overall quick assessment around it. You do your traditional process assessment around within the procurement space, category management, strategic thinking, sourcing execution, contract execution, or transactional work, how you're doing against the peers or against the industry. Do that quick assessment and figure out where the gaps are. And then look at your organization and think about how you want to manage the organization to support your business needs, right? And then to identify what those business needs look like, need to make sure that you are talking to your business unit leader, CEO, to figure out what their priorities look like, right? And then figure out what your overall plan looks like.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times it's important to kind of really understand what your overall organization's objectives and what industry requirements are.
Yeah.
And then coming up with that overarching objective to figure out what that might look like. And now that decides your next round of conversations, whether it's organization, process, technology, and then figure out the plan for that. So that's like more of a high level, maybe 30-day plan in general.
When we go into that assessment, the assessment phase, a couple of things. If you could talk a little bit about how long and the level of depth for an assessment like that, but I'd love to know a little bit more about what's involved in the individual elements of that plan and who do you involve in it? You know, you're involving folks from the procurement team, you're involving stakeholders in that initial kind of laying the land.
So I think let's say in a 100-day plan, I would say the first 30-day is your information gathering and assessment and figuring out the gaps, right? So I would say the first 2 weeks, do interviews with all of your business unit leaders, CEO, and gain a good understanding of what their priorities look like and what the pain points look like. Right? So that's one. And in parallel, start talking to your own team to get a sense for what are some of the things that they are doing well in their mind and what are some of the things that they think we should do differently, right? And then you triangulate that with like those observations and kind of say, okay, this is what my clients want, this is what my team says, this is where the gaps are, and then start getting that within the first 2 to 3 weeks or so as part of your interviews. I would expect for a medium-sized company like $1 billion plus revenue, like let's say $1 to $5 billion, it most probably means it's maybe 20 to 30 interviews to our conversations within the first couple of weeks. That's a lot of synthesis that you need to do at the end of those 2 weeks, right? And then the next 2 weeks is really then any deep dives that you need to do based on the pain points and have follow-on conversations to come up with more systematic expectations around that. And by week 4, you should have like a good sense for what the current state is.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's like the first 4 weeks. The next 4 weeks is...
Can I just ask on that? How important are quick wins within that first 4 weeks? So you may sit, with in some of those discussions or interviews in the first week or two and hear there's, maybe it's a consistent pain point in something to do with the purchase to pay process, let's say as an example. Would you recommend that a new CPO dive straight into fixing a pain or two as a goodwill gesture, or are we getting ahead of ourselves and maybe not taking the time to sit back and kind of reflect on the entire situation and unintended consequences of making short-term fixes?
So I think my recommendation in that would be, unless it is a supply constraint or supply risk where it's truly a business risk for continuity, try to buy yourself those 4 weeks to get a good sense for the pain points.
Yeah.
I think one thing that might, like, the bias to action is great, but I think when you try to jerk the organization around for every small issue that is in the pipeline, you actually might create a little bit challenges from a change management perspective. So I think I would recommend, I think, use that time to actually gain a good understanding of what the pain points are. And you can set the expectations with individuals. I say you're not asking for like 5 months, 6 months to kind of fix some of these small issues, but you're just going to prioritize the actions and making sure that they're getting what they're looking for, right? If it is a key issue like supply constraint, it's never going to be, it doesn't even need to have a conversation about or interviews. I think it's going to become very obvious when you get into it, right? So I think the small wins are important, the quick wins are important to gain credibility, but making sure that doing the right things so that you can gain the credibility. So example I would use is, let's say you're a manufacturing firm, and one of the quick wins might be, let's say, office supplies, fixing the office supply process through catalog, right? It may not be as important for the core business. So to doing that, like, it might be a quick win, but it may not be as relevant for that industry in general to gain the credibility. It might be just considered like a back office function fix quickly, right? So you want to kind of figure out what those big ticket items that carry weight within those 30 to 9. And then fixing those within those 30 days is going to be very difficult, because some of these big ticket items that carry the weight most probably need a little bit longer planning to be able to do that, right? So I would say, if there are things like, a lot of times what some people make as a mistake is, let's say, oh, I'm going to bring in a P2P platform and that's going to fix everything that is wrong with my process, right? That's not the answer. So the answer is really, okay, let me understand where the process gaps are. And P2P technology platform is an enabler to solve that, right? It doesn't need to be this big bang approach to drive that. And another thing, like, I'm a strong believer, if you're aware of, it's like the rule of 37X, which is you do 1% incremental change every day without degradation. In a year, you get 37 times improvement. Versus a lot of organizations do this big bang, 2 or 3 initiatives in a year, and then you get a big degradation associated with that. So versus, I think, if you take your time to understand the pain points, do that incremental organic change consistently, I think the output at the end of the year will be much stronger and stickier as compared to doing big bang approach.
Okay, so try and have some restraint in terms of quickly fixing things, and unless, as you say, they're mission critical. So we're 30 days in. You've done a quick assessment of the team, the organization, the operating model, what some of the fixes, or not necessarily the fixes, what some of the challenges and problems are. Where do you kind of go in your second month?
I think the second month, initially, then it comes down to what are some of the process improvements that you need to make, and how you're going to organizationally manage it, right? So a lot of times, what happens is the leaders go with a point of view, what worked in the previous organization, and say, oh, no, it worked for me to just hire a service provider and that fixes everything. And then it basically, it's your mess for less, right? That type of behavior a little bit, which is not necessarily the right approach. I think you can figure out, okay, these are the process fixes that I need to do. I don't have an organization to support it. How do I enable the organization to be able to do that? Right. So that's like the next question that you need to ask. And then the answer for that a lot of times comes back is, I don't have right people, or I don't have enough people, right? So capacity, the traditional constraints, right? So you have capacity constraint, you have skills constraint, right? So how do you enable that? Now, sometimes the answer comes back, okay, I need to drive a lot of change within the organization. And for that, I need to have people that I can trust. I either have those people or I don't. And even if I have those, I don't have history with them. So should I look at somebody that I worked with previously and bring them on to drive that change, right? That could be one of the decisions within those like 30 to 60 days, saying, okay, can I bring 1 or 2 leaders that can drive the change that I need to drive, right? And then the next decision in that is, how do I functionally organize myself to deliver the objectives? And I think we still see like 60-70% of the organization still go with that center-led functional organization approach, which tends to be effective in most of the cases, unless you are so super entrepreneurial where it just doesn't work, right? Where everything needs to sit within the BU, which is rare and rare. Even in the startups, I think the functional center-led still works. I think you end up there as a starting point. And then you kind of say, okay, do I have the skills to be able to drive that change in that center-led organization, efficiency and effectiveness? And how do I staff it up to do that?
How many times when in your experience, does a new CPO come into an organization that already has that center-led operating model versus coming into one where, it's decentralized or even fully centralized, and that's part of the prescription, if you will, to solve some of the challenges is to go to a center-led model?
So I would say it is most probably 60-40. 60% of the times it's already some level of maturity on the center-led, just not efficient and effective. I think you might have like org kind of structured, but it's kind of hybrid, hodgepodge of stuff that whatever works, right? That type of thing. And out of the 40% where it's not there is either because of the org maturity, because they are truly were a startup that just grew bigger, and it's just businesses running like BU-led procurement organizations, right? I would say that's like 40%, or they are in the early stages of centralizing the procurement organization to drive the influence. So I would say it's 60-40 when it comes to that. I think that both of those spectrum, very rarely, I would say, not really, out of 60%, I would say half of them have figured out some level of good roadmap to get to that centralized model. And the other half are still kind of stumbling around to figure it out how they're going to make it work.
As you're starting to, so you talked about, do I need new resources as an example? At what point are you looking at technology as well and saying, okay, this is kind of where what my current tech stack is versus a to-be tech stack? Is that part of this initial kind of 30, 60-day review? Are we still doing that at a relatively high level before going deeper, once you're further into the role? Kind of how do you look at technology fitting into this?
No, so I think the first 30 days, you still get a good sense for what like 30 to 60 days where you're doing the process deep dive. You're doing technology deep dive at the same time. So you kind of try to get a sense for what your overall tech stack looks like. And you're going to get a good understanding of what works, what doesn't work, because it's going to become evident, right, as part of the conversation. And then I think that 60 to 90 day kind of putting the plan together, you kind of start thinking about what's your overall technology strategy. And the technology strategy it's basically 3 different strategies that you can take, right? So number 1 is you just choose which process functions, how they're going to interact with each other, and you choose best in class for each of those process functions. Right? Whether it's category management, source to contract, and P2P, different technologies, or orchestration, you can kind of figure it out, like what is important for you, and figure out best in class within those, and they kind of work together and have a patchwork system to be able to make it work for you. So that's number 1. Number 2 is, okay, I don't want to deal with all this various hodgepodge of patchwork. I have limited resources on technology. I'm going to go with one big system that does 70-80% in most of the cases, and that's enough for me at this point of time, right? It still tends to be expensive because both of those options are still pretty expensive, right? When it comes to what works, what doesn't work, and the deployment times could be a little bit longer, right? And then the third option that we are seeing more and more of is people figure out, okay, I don't need best in class, or I don't need a big system. I'm just going to build small use cases that are critical for me to enable myself to deliver the work. And we're seeing a lot more of that. So for example, we work with our clients to kind of say, okay, let's figure out the 10 use cases within the procurement space that you need generative AI technology within your own ERP system will do some bolt-ons on top of it to make it work for you, right? So we're seeing some of that trend as well as part of the overall systematic usage of technology. Now that's still kind of in the initial stages because these technologies are maturing. But I think people are starting to realize is the first two options are still quite expensive when it comes to like in and out and the deployment part. And the faster time to value becomes option 3. And you can go to option 2 and option 1 with that option 3 regardless whenever you're ready for it. So you can get started with it. We've seen that as well.
I've always felt, especially with the explosion of tools out there now, that it's a great way to step into something bigger. Is you're looking at something that, as you say, maybe 70% or 80% of what you need. It may not even be that. It may only be 50%, but it takes you from zero to something at relatively low cost, and then that helps you kind of build the business case for going into the option 1 or option 2. Once you've demonstrated that actually technology can help us be more effective, more efficient, more impactful.
Absolutely.
Do you find that a new CPO is in an environment where that's the easiest time in their reign to make a business case for investment? Or, because you talked about you might need some more people, or you might need some different people, you might need some new technology. All of this costs money. And I think famously, procurement struggles sometimes in getting the investment it needs to grow. So is this the optimum time as you've put together your plan, kind of that 60 to 90 days, to then be able to go and ask for and make a pitch for investment to deliver on those plans?
So I think it depends on where they are in the org, right? So if the organization is a fast-growing organization, I think this would be the right time to put together the plan for org growth and org investments and say, okay, we're going to grow at 20, 30% year over year for next year, and we're not organized or staffed enough to be able to support that. And with this, like I can create X $1 million P&L impact or revenue generation, whatever the value generation activity is, and come up with a business case for that. I think that's an easier sell when it comes to like a new CPO. I think if it is a shrinking organization, we find actually it's easier to also create a business case for procurement because you can save money. And you can say, okay, if I can invest $1 million, I can return $10 million in profit improvement. That's 10x ROI. And it might be a one-time investment, and it might be even with a service provider for one-time investment to run the sourcing and get that benefit, right? So that could be it as well. But still 80% of the organizations fall within that in the middle where it's like, it's not shrinking, but it's not quite growing as fast. So like, how do you create the case for it, right? And I think that's where doing a good gap assessment, doing this functional assessment within that 30 to 60 days and kind of say, okay, I have gaps here, and I have mitigation in certain cases within the current construct. How do I fill in the other gaps with creative ways, right? And it's generally a hybrid. The hybrid is generally you bring in people that you trust to drive change. That's an easy one. You swap the resources where it doesn't make sense, or for your overall agenda, you need to make some organizational changes to make that center-led model or whatever model that you choose. And then you kind of figure out like cost neutral approach to change of the workforce, right? That's the second approach. And then the third approach is you kind of, like we see this because of our industry, is bring in a service provider to fill in the gaps for short run, so that you can say, I'm going to deliver X in results for these next 24 months. I'm going to enable it with this hybrid model of in-source, change of roles, and bring in a third party as an augmented model. Because you can't do it all. I think the struggle is if it's a lot of change, doing everything in-house, it's a lot difficult than maybe doing this hybrid model where you bring in a service provider and then you can hold the service provider accountable for the results, right? That's a little bit easier than putting yourself accountable for results at times. So I think that becomes kind of a hybrid model that a lot of people kind of figure out.
Also for, we talked a little, at the beginning about that mid-cap size, the $1 billion to $5 billion revenue. At that level, you can't possibly really build a business case for experts in all the different categories that you might need support in. And so,
Absolutely.
I've talked for the last 10 years on the show about the virtues of hybrid in-source, outsource delivery models to support that. But when it comes back to quick wins, and be able to get some trust and some goodwill in the bank, just a really effective way of, immediately being able to switch on some expertise that you're not necessarily going to have access to yourself.
Absolutely. Yeah.
How important is the brand of procurement and messaging around the procurement value proposition in those first 100 days, or is that something that you demonstrate your impact by doing, and you don't necessarily focus on the marketing of what procurement can do? Like, where would that typically fit?
So I think that one is an interesting question. It depends on. I don't think this is specifically to a CPO's first 90 days.
Yeah.
I would say this is more focused on what your to-do list looks like.
Mm-hmm.
If one of the objective is to gain credibility within the organization as fast as you can, then the branding becomes important.
Yeah.
So let's say, and we work, like one of our clients we work with, like super entrepreneurial, everything was managed within the business units. And over there, it was critical to say, okay, we centralize the procurement and we are branding procurement as an execution powerhouse.
Yeah.
And that was important for them to drive that communication with the business units.
Yeah.
And the reason to do that was because it was so powerful from a messaging perspective. The business units, it caught eye of business units. Okay, you're going to manage my procurement. How are you going to do it? Like, have the conversation around it, right? And it was very critical to have that dialogue. But I think a lot of times, if you have kind of hybrid structure already set up where you're getting things done, just not as efficiently and effectively, maybe the branding is not as important within the first 90 days.
Yeah.
It might be after you figure out what your priorities for process technology and what your long-term roadmap looks like. And then you roll that out as part of the branding, maybe in the second quarter of your tenure. Then you have the credibility, some low-hanging wins, and then also some structure and overall direction that you can communicate really well with the business. And then that becomes like a lot stickier change management as compared to just doing a big bang branding exercise.
Yeah, it somewhat depends on the state that you find yourself and the remit, whether it's business as usual but continuous improvement versus transformation. I love branding and messaging as part of repositioning procurement as part of transformation, but oftentimes, in those interviews you hear, well, I've heard all this before, what's going to be different this time? And so, it definitely makes sense that you need to prove what's different before you start talking about all the ways that you're going to make things different.
And it comes down to, if you have some quick wins, you have some good conversations around, I understand your business well, and this is how I'm going to help you. I think that becomes a lot better branding conversation than saying, okay, my new procurement brand is X and a big website and roadshows, but there isn't really the depth to the conversation because you haven't spent enough time with them.
Yeah,
that kind of takes a lot bigger change management as compared to.
We just want you to forget everything that was bad before because things are different. So I know it's about time to wrap up, but I have one last question. So if a CPO is now 100 days in and reflecting on that first 100 days, what would success look like for them? When they reflect on what they've achieved.
So I think that's another great question. So one, at the end of 90 days, I think after you do an assessment and kind of gap analysis, having a strong understanding of people, process, technology, and where you have gaps.
Yeah.
And if you can articulate that in simple words and come up with a plan to address it, that's number one. I know it's an operational activity, but not a lot of leaders actually are able to do that because they just get swamped with the tactical transactional work in the organization quickly, right?
Yeah.
And then it becomes busy work and you're never able to get out of that as fast as you want it to be, right? So if you have that, that's definitely a big success.
So you have to protect your time from that. Yeah. I'll be mindful to protect against getting sucked into some of the day-to-day operational work.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's number one. Number two is, I would say, when you do the interviews first time with the business unit leaders that are your partners in driving value for the organization, I think do a gut check, or we call it basically client implied promise, right? You talk to them about what is expected of us as an organization, have the same conversation after 3 months, and see, like, do a gut check around, temperature check around how do they feel about your plan. And if it is positive, it's definitely going in the right direction. So that's another kind of big checkbox at the end of three months, that you have people that are going to help you drive the agenda within the organization, right? So that's like number 2. Number 3 is, do you have an organization plan that can support these objectives, right? That includes whether you have right skill set, whether you have right leaders, right? And if you have, I don't expect that within 3 months you have all the leaders identified where like everything is buttoned up. But do you have action plan to identify who those leaders are and how you're going to basically create that hybrid structure that we talked about, right? Whether it is in-source, outsource, it doesn't matter what the strategy is, but do you have the right leaders for that? Because ultimately, at the end of 90 days, you want to have a plan, say within 6 months or 12 months, I will have an organization that helps me achieve objectives for next 3 years, right? As a leader. And if the answer is yes, I have a plan, I have a roadmap to get to that, I think that's definitely a success, because ultimately it's having those strong leaders that you enable to be able to drive the agenda that you're trying to drive within the organization. And then finally, I would say, let's say if you have access to a CEO or access to a CFO, try to see how the procurement's objectives fit into overall organization's financials, and have a strong interlock around how do you add value to the organization, whether it's cost savings, whether it's improving PTI, whether it's improving revenue, whether it's improving the overall go-to-market strategy, right? Whatever those priorities are, do you have a strong interlock with your CEO or CFO that shows that you have a strong plan that is consistent with what the leaders are looking at within the organization? If you get a checkbox for that at the end of 90 days, it's definitely a successful 90 days as well.
So I think I said that was my last question, but I have a follow-up. There's this balance to be had between moving quickly and taking your time and being deliberate in terms of change management. And I think that we live in this world where everyone expects fast results or expects quick change. How do you balance that? Like, how do you ensure that you're not moving too slowly, that the organization thinks, I'm not really sure if this is going the way that we want it to, and not going so fast that you're breaking things along the way and you're upsetting everybody, because it's more like that bull in a china shop that I talked about at the start when you're wanting to make changes? Like, how do you balance those two things? Or is it more around being in lockstep with your exec stakeholders to make sure they're comfortable with the pace of change?
So I think that's a great question. I mean, you want to have a very intentional approach to change. Don't be over analytical to have everything buttoned up to be able to drive change, right? And it goes back to that conversation around 1% change every day. So identify those first 90 days, what that 1% might look like, right? And it could be as simple as, let's get what your priorities for these next 90 days look like, and how do I help you to achieve those objectives for 90 days, right? So, and if you get, and you can say, I may not be able to do all of it, but if you choose the top 2 or 3 for each of them, that's still like a very intentional approach to results, right? And then that drives a different conversation. But I think what is critical is, you need to balance the speed and results, because fast moving is great, but when it comes with a bunch of broken glass at the end of 90 days, it might be actually worse off in the longer run than the fast results that you're expecting out of that.
Yeah, you can't change your first impression, can you? If you're breaking things in the first 90 days, you can damage a lot of relationships before you've even started.
And then the second piece is, I think a lot of times it's human nature, when you are a strong operator or you have a strong bias to operations or action, we tend to over-rotate on the feedback that we get. So let's say if we get a negative feedback, our immediate action is, okay, I need to fix it. and I'm going to fix it that point of time and sub-optimize maybe something in the bigger picture in the longer run. But that is absolutely okay if it's like critical. But like taking like few minutes to really understand, like in the bigger schema, how does it apply and does it drive bigger change? I think that will actually yield better results and a balanced results as compared to like moving from problem to problem to problem.
Right.
And then the third thing I would say is when you take that approach, sometimes, let's say a procurement governance or the approach that you take in driving results, it may yield into like more zero-sum game, right? Where it's always you are helping one person and then maybe hurting another party. And then you don't want to be in that spot. You want to make sure that you're driving the right actions and consensus when it comes to driving the strategic value for the organization. So absolutely critical that you drive some of the results so that you showcase like action-orientedness as a CPO, but at the same time, be intentional about it so that you're not over-rotating on every small task that is at hand.
Well, Darshan, I know it's time to wrap up. Went a little bit long, but I always love talking, and there's so much more insight that we can pull from, understanding the do's, the don'ts, the roadblocks, the landmines, but also the opportunities for a CPO in their first 90 to 100 days. So I really appreciate you kind of setting the scene and breaking it up into those chunks. If anybody who is listening would like to just learn a little bit more, dig a little bit deeper, then I will put a link to your LinkedIn profile in the show notes for today's episode. I'll also link up to ProcureAbility's website as well. And anybody who's listening can connect with you or your team directly through that link and the contact us form on the website. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Phil.
Yeah, my pleasure. And I look forward to us doing this again soon. Thanks a lot, Darshan.